Hello and welcome to episode 179 of the Chills of Will podcast. Pleasure today to be joined by Sarah Cypher. Here's a bit about Sarah. Freelance book editor and author of The Skin and Its Girl, which is going to be the main focus of our conversation today. The Skin and Its Girl, as you're listening to this on Tuesday, the 25th of April, it is out. Out. Go buy it. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. She has an MFA from the Program for Writers at Warren Wilson College, where she was a Rona, Jaffe graduate creative writing fellow in fiction. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, New Ohio Review, North American Review, Leon, Leon as an acronym, Leon Literary Review, Crab Orchard Review, and others. She grew up in a Lebanese Christian family near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and lives in Washington, D.C. with her wife. I skipped one on purpose there, Sarah. It's Majuscule, one of the literary.
Majuscule. Hmm.
Okay, all right, all right. I
It's
wasn't I
a,
wasn't prepared.
it's okay.
Okay.
Mike Lindgren is the editor. It's a small online magazine, but
Awesome,
he puts out some really good stuff.
awesome. Well, good afternoon, good evening. How are you?
I'm fine, Peter. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be talking to you. The Skin and This Girl is an incredible read, and like I said, people to be listening, it's out. Talk to us about the good stuff, like where to buy it, any bookstore recommendations, and just also how it feels to be as we're talking, a day and a half, 2 days before it comes out. What's it like in all the midst of all this? I hope it's a lot of fun, but what's it like to have this book out in the world?
Oh, wow. I was just over at my sister's house this afternoon and everybody was asking me if I'm excited. And I said, that's one of the emotions, yes. But the thought of it finally being out, I've worked on it for a very long time. I've had myself up to the eyeballs in the written word for as long as I can remember.
Hmm.
One of my first paid jobs was at Walden Books. So
Oh wow, oh yeah.
yeah, I know I'm dating myself a bit. But I'm a big fan of librarians. My sister's a librarian, booksellers. I mean, obviously, I'm going to encourage people to buy it from their local indie or bookshop.org
Hmm.
online if that's what they prefer. But the audiobook is also really great.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's just the publishing team has done a wonderful job with it. I'm really happy to see it out and to have been working with some really great people over the last 18 months.
Yeah, and whichever the windows people are looking at, you can see the windows of the Zoom. You can see the cover better in your shot. The cover is awesome.
I was so excited about it. I mean, you hear horror stories about if you're working with a big five publisher, you have no agency in that whole
Mm,
process, and you get what they give you. But
sure.
Valentine at Penguin Random House has been absolutely inclusive of my input the whole way through. We went through
Mm.
this series of excellent meetings where I shared covers that inspired me, and we
Uh-huh.
talked through it, and I wrote a whole post about it on my Substack.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah, so if anybody's like really curious about the whole process of publishing a
Yeah.
book, then my Substack is the place to go for that.
Well, I'll definitely share that in the series notes and the episode notes, I
Thanks.
should say. That's
Mhm.
cool. Okay. I would have loved to have seen written and illustrated by, but maybe you're not an illustrator, maybe not an artist, visual artist.
Actually, I started out drawing before I was a writer. I mean, on
Mm.
my mother's side of the family, the Lebanese side of the family, there's just some incredible artists. I mean, a cousin who's a tattoo artist. My grandfather did wonderful wildlife paintings,
Hmm.
but it was always a hobby. And I grew up with their talent as a model. Um, but as one of the first women in my family to go to college, and obviously the first person to be able to pursue the arts professionally,
Mhm.
I'm just so grateful to finally have gotten to this point with my writing,
Yeah.
and but there's some beautiful illustrations in the book. We hired an illustrator
Right.
to draw a literal family tree.
Oh yeah.
Rumani, that the family name means pomegranate, so the family tree is a pomegranate tree.
One of the greatest fruits in the world, right?
Delicious.
Top five. I mean, I don't know. Uh, yeah. So, I mean, you were talking about being a reader since day one. I would love to, well, maybe not literally day one, but I would love to hear about your relationship with the written word. You talk about the arts in your family, and obviously writing is a form of art. Did
Mhm.
you, I mean, monolingual English? Did you grow up speaking other languages? Like, how did that work as well? And what were you reading as a kid?
Sure. I mean, I grew up with English as my only language. My mother's side of the family, the Lebanese side, was just kind of fully assimilated at that point. I mean, we still went to the Syrian Orthodox Church. There was obviously the food, which was, hold
Wow.
on to those recipes at all costs. But by the time I was growing up, my grandfather would speak a little bit of Arabic with kind of his generation,
Okay.
who was left of them, and never really with us. I mean, I have this sort of like bastardized Arabic words for a
Okay.
few things around the house that we used instead of the English word, that I kind of figured out as a process of elimination with my peers in school that these were not English words. But I we were a kind of introverted, bookish family. My mother read to me kind of before I could read. Trips to the library were always exciting. I
Mhm.
volunteered at the library starting, I think, in middle school. I worked at Walden Books. All of my work was editorial in nature. I'm a freelance book editor. I've done that for 20
Yeah,
years.
yeah, yeah.
And I mean, I just read everything that I could get my hands on. I mean, storytelling is, you know, sort of oral storytelling as well as written storytelling is really important to me.
Mhm.
Um, but I think in starting to think about the skin and its girl and what I was really trying to achieve, I was interested in the stories that don't get told too. So there was kind of an
Mhm.
engagement with silence and absence of language. So sort of that contrast was really interesting to me as well. But
Mm.
growing up in a really small town, I mean, books were my way of teleporting elsewhere. I mean, I
Yeah.
just the availability of other lives through books
Hmm.
has always been a source of inspiration for me.
Do you feel like the reading you did was to seek out those different worlds and to find yourself? I mean, the whole, what is it, windows and doors. I mean, did you, all the different cultures and subcultures that make us all up, did you feel like you saw yourself on the page, or did that not matter?
I don't, I mean, in retrospect, no, I didn't see myself on the page. I mean, if we're talking about, sexual orientation, if we're talking about sort of the identity markers that we're most fluent with at, our moment.
Hmm.
Um, but I was a daydreamer of a kid. I mean, I loved science. I loved fairy tales. I loved reading about other parts of the world. I just I mean, that was the food for my imagination. But
Mhm.
I tell this story that I grew up in kind of the 80s and 90s, and for the longest time, whenever Ellen DeGeneres came out, I thought a lesbian was one word, Alesbian,
Uh-huh.
and I realized later my mistake, and it really speaks to how unspeakable
Wow.
alternative sexualities and queerness is, as a whole. It was just not present in my upbringing, or if it was a joke or negative.
Uh-huh.
So it really, kind of, you asked about like finding myself. I mean, I think that was a process that came later, like, you know when I finally left my small town public school and finally, you know, kind of came out and kind of lived far from where I grew up. I
Hmm.
felt like that was when I could sort of read and, have a community with some intentionality. And I think that is so important. And I mean, obviously, we're talking about this at the time when there's, 400 and some anti-LGBTQ bills against, libraries and trans rights and drag shows. And I mean, I will die on this hill if I have to. Representation really does matter. And,
Hmm.
like I said, my sister is a librarian, and, they're seeing these unprecedented pushbacks from parents in their school districts. And, it's an active resistance. And I think that we need to keep talking about this because it's important.
Thank you for that. When talking about putting, words together, are you saying act of resistance, active resistance, both? I mean,
Both,
where
yes, action matters, yes.
where do you feel like the active resistance is coming from? It with
um,
librarians and with the push, like how is that pushback coming, I guess?
I mean, I'm sharing the secondhand from my sister, but I mean, it sounds like that there are often a few, vocal parents in a school district that take issue with books that, are about, LGBTQ or queer content. Often not having read those books, but
Right.
finding something objectionable in them and wanting to get them removed from the library. And,
Mm.
when that, here in Virginia, where I live, that has gotten amplified with this draft bill to, should we just shut down all libraries and we'll just take care of this problem once and for all? So, I mean, I don't think that's a common sense solution. I don't think anyone would agree that that's a common sense solution.
Mm.
But there's a unsettling radicalism about it.
Oh
I
God,
mean,
yeah.
I grew up in a very conservative part of the country, and I was never not encouraged to read and be curious about people. So it's a tricky time, I think.
Incredible regression, right?
It seems like it in some
Seems like it.
places. I
Right,
mean,
right. And like you said, it is a lot of times does seem to be just a very vocal minority, but they're the ones that are often making the laws and the policies. The when you talk about, and what a microcosm of a story, what a telling story about thinking a lesbian was one word. Is that the inspiration for a lot when Betty, right, when Betty's writing letters back and forth with her pen pal, she gets corrected
no,
because she put okay.
no,
Okay.
but those were fun to write, to think about language, or try to remember how I thought about language when I was 8 and 9 years old and
Yeah.
the mistakes that I would make. And I don't know. I think children just learning language
Hmm.
bring a really fresh view of it. That, I
Yes.
mean, we quote unquote correct mistakes, but sometimes they're not mistakes and they can be really revealing. There's something really poetic about
Definitely.
that innocence. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you have some really bold strokes in the book, and which are so good. And there's also some really subtle ones that I really enjoyed. Like I enjoyed when is it pronounced Nua, Nuha,
Nuha.
Nuha,
Mm-hmm.
when it was early on in the book, and it was like I think she didn't answer the phone. It was basically like, what's this 78-year-old misanthrope, doing on a whatever night, not answering the phone. I thought that was pretty classic. Like, what else did she have to do? And then also appreciate, the how Anna was the one who corrected the girl. Anna was the one who corrected the a lot, and it's like I get that too when you're younger and you do learn those things. You're very authoritarian on it, right? Like, oh, this is the way it's done. I just learned it yesterday, but this is the way it's done. A lot is 2 words. My teacher told me, my sister told me. So you really capture a lot of those nuances and subtleties for sure.
Well,
Um,
20 years as an editor has taught me to not be
uh-huh.
a grammarian, and that there's a much livelier kind of language available. I mean, especially as a fiction writer, you can't
Yeah,
be very
definitely.
rigid.
What you were talking about, how representation matters. How did that kind of come into view for you as you got into high school and college? Like maybe who are some of the writers or mentors or works that really captured your attention?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. I was in an AP English class with only two other students. I mean, it was a very small high school.
Wow.
And there was an exercise that we did that I still love it, and I still do it sometimes. And I often advise writers that I work with to try
Mm,
um, that when you're trying to explore voices outside of your own or sort of
hmm.
your default voice, to read, a work of whoever and try to mimic a few paragraphs of their style, or like, handwrite some of their passages as if they're
What is
your own,
that?
to kind of,
Handwriting. Handwriting. Who
yes.
does that? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I don't know, do we still learn that?
Just
I
kidding.
hope so. But to copy a few paragraphs as if it's your own, to kind of like give your
Mm,
brain that muscle memory,
mm,
and then try to get that sound in something that you write. So I think we did that exercise, or the writer that I chose for that exercise was Franz Kafka.
ah.
And I magical realism and sort of absurdist, imaginative fiction, and horror, and using these genres as a way to write about sort of real phenomenon in our experience, that still informs my writing now.
Mm. And so I mean, up in in the 2020s, 2023,
Mhm.
who would you do that exercise with? Who are some of the writers that you're just like, oh man, I can't wait for her next book, his next book, next short story, poem? Like, who are some of the writers that
Oh,
really
wow.
thrill you?
I just finished Patricia Engel's Infinite Country,
Mm,
and she has such a deft, clean style that, without sort of departing very far from realism, but still writing somewhat about Colombian folklore and
Mm.
you know, borders and history and immigration, that I write in these bold strokes, and that she's a much more subtle writer, and I
Mm.
like to learn some of those lessons. But who else have I been reading? Katie Kitamora's Intimacies.
Okay.
I really admired that style. I was reading a lot of W.G. Sebald during the pandemic because I was doing a lot of walking in national parks and taking
Uh-huh.
pictures, and
Sure.
the Rings of Saturn, like sort of like
Uh-huh.
long hypotactic sentences, um, you know, and then if that's one kind of auto fiction, then I was reading Rachel Cusk and sort of surprised how simple the voice is, and sort of understanding how you can write either very this like very ornate style or this very simple style, but still achieve this almost trance-like focus.
Mm.
It's some thoughts that I'm bringing into the current project that I'm working on. But
All right.
I need to encounter other voices because sometimes I get really sick of my own voice.
I forget who it was that I was talking to, but college professor was saying that Katie Kimura, is that the right first name?
Katie Kitamura, yeah.
Kitamura, that intimacies is huge amongst his college population.
Yeah, it's a lot of the writers that I'm friends with have read it. I mean, it's sort of recommended to me from all these different angles, and I finally
Hmm.
read it, and I found it just intense and, I mean, intimate, while the narrator is also sort of figuring herself out, or trying to figure out um, her place in this foreign city, and this profession.
Hmm.
I don't know. There was a lot going on, and I need to read it again, actually, just
Hmm.
to understand
Yeah.
all of what she had activated in there. But it's a wonderful novel.
Huh. So, this I wonder about like just like muses and creativity. I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
talk about giving yourself activities or exercises. Like, I mean, I guess in maybe connected to the skin in this girl, like how, I guess just like Palestine as a muse for you. You wrote about it, and I think in the acknowledgments about, kind of, I think you call it a quote privilege. You have an Anglo last name, and but just obviously all the troubles with citizenship and getting a green card or tourist visa or whatever it would be to go and do the research there. So I guess I'm
Mm-hmm.
just kind of wondering. I guess I'm just getting at like the seeds for the book, like why this story? How did you get into the story? Was it, is it about Betty, the narrator? Is it about Nua? Like, how did you get into the book, and maybe some of the research that took you into the skin in this girl?
Yeah, sure. That there are a lot of levels of answers to that question. I mean, because I've working on and off for about 15 years.
Oh
I'd set
wow.
it aside and written another novel,
Hmm.
and I got an agent and failed to sell, and I kind of picked it up again after a while whenever I was in an MFA program. Um, so I mean, I guess to answer the heart of the question, I mean, I'm a second generation Arab American. Betty Romani, my protagonist with the blue skin, is a second generation Arab American.
Hmm.
And I started writing the seeds of the novel maybe a handful of years after 9/11. I was a college senior when it happened. And I really think about my sort of the Arab side of my family, that identity in two parts or two chapters, sort of like before 9/11 and after 9/11.
Hmm.
And that there was something that I felt before it that I didn't need to define. I mean, it was in the church and the family names, and the family stories and the food, and how I related to my elder generations. Um, but there wasn't a big Lebanese Syrian community where I was from. I mean, quite dense. You
Hmm.
know, when you look at the population centers throughout the country, but in my school, I think I was one of maybe two
Hmm.
students who had Lebanese Syrian ancestry. But whenever I went to college, one of my dearest friends to this day grew up in Saudi Arabia. She's Pakistani. And she was talking to me about, actually, in an interview for her podcast, about this
Hmm.
experience of coming to this sort of small rural Western Pennsylvania town that
Hmm.
felt really alien from what she was, you know, what she grew up with, and then came to our house and had all this food that she was very familiar with.
Hmm.
So that there was something like this very um, sort of warm and I didn't need to be able to frame it or talk about it. But then after 9/11 and sort of the rise in anti-Arab sentiment and Islamophobia, I felt for the first time, and I get into this in The Skin and Its Girl too, that identity often forms against something else,
Mm.
or whenever you feel that you're trying to define what you are, what you aren't matters as well.
Uh-huh.
Um, so I was thinking about my identity in that context as well whenever I was starting to write this story. And as a queer woman, and sort of growing up in a conservative Arab American family, I mean, there's obviously stories that I didn't tell, or that weren't told, or identities that weren't modeled for me, or secrets that I didn't want to share with my family. So
Mm.
in thinking about how do we frame the story of ourselves, and starting to write this, sort of the early scenes of this book, I was really interested in Palestine because I mean, there's a whole cultural identity that is often defined against something else. I mean, it's such a conflict-ridden place, and it really struggles for the attention that it deserves in American media.
Mm.
Um, that I just felt like there was a lot to learn through that lens.
Mm.
And then later on in the process, I really got hooked on this idea of traditional Palestinian soap. Like here's a cube of it,
Okay.
and it's it's an interesting object because it's made with just a few ingredients that are all very local to the city of Nablus. So
Uh-huh.
olive oil, traditionally the ashes of a certain plant that grew in the River Jordan, the water in the area that was famed for being good. Like the way we say that New York water makes the best bagels,
Huh.
like Nabalsi water would make the best soap.
Okay.
So at that point in the writing process, I felt like it was time for me to go there because there's only so much that you can learn through books. I
Sure.
mean, at that point, I had studied Arabic for several years. I, had my own community, and I obviously found a lot of academic texts to research the history of the city and everything else. But when I went to the Middle East, I had my father's last name, and I read as pretty white. And I'm also aware that people with traditional Palestinian last names, or are not as white presenting, have a much harder time at the airport, and sometimes don't get into the country.
Hmm.
So I had a lot of that in my mind, and I was worried about traveling, but I just aware of the privilege that I didn't get harassed, and I was able
Hmm.
to conduct my research. I spent some time in Nablus. I toured these sort of 600 and 800-year-old soap factories.
Wow.
Um, actually 4 years to the day almost that I was there, uh, and came back with a lot to write about. And I don't think I could have written this book without going there physically. Like that was an
Hmm.
essential part of the creative process, as well as sort of the ethical process as well.
Hmm. Thank you for that. You talk about
Mhm.
going there and the the can't think of a simple word. The epigraph is, quote, we travel like other people, but do not return to anything.
Mhm.
I want to say from Darwish.
Mahmoud Darwish, yes.
Right. And just the idea of, of Palestine as a place, as an idea. There's that really, in some ways testy, but in some ways almost humorous, like dark humor with where the two sisters are at the interrogation at the with the Israeli soldiers, right? And it's, they're like, there is no Palestine, that kind of thing. Obviously, I mean,
Mhm.
that's the whole some of the bulk of the bulk of the conflict is ideas of right to return, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder what if kind of the epigraph came last, if that was kind of a jumping off point, if it was a first, kind of a jumping off point for the book, and kind of what you were going for with that.
Sure. I mean I mean Darwish's poems matter a lot to me, and those particular lines came pretty early. I mean, the poem is really about not being able to go home to the place that you knew, and that
Mm-hmm.
you're historically connected to. Um, so you tell stories of that place,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and that an existence, and the poetry of a place can be passed from one to another, and if you can't access that place physically, then sort of the imaginative register and the language and the songs and the poetry of that place keep it alive, along with sort of the hope to be able to go back. And I mean, I'm a writer, I'm not a politician. I'm getting into the particulars, but I mean, that there is that hope that runs through a lot of Darwish's poetry, and certainly for my characters as well.
Does epistolary mean, does it have to be literally letters? Like, I mean, is it, the book is, Betty is the narrator. She's speaking at the grave of Nuha, her aunt, her auntie. Betty herself has a tough decision to make about should she leave the country with her lover, right? And that's where the narration takes place. I mean, would this book be epistolary?
Yeah, I mean, I think typically when we talk about it, we do mean letters, but it is a direct address novel, and
Sure.
I mean, there is sort of the one chapter that is titled epistolary, that is a lot of the letters that Betty exchanges with her friend in school. But I noticed as sort of my thinking about that style is that there's a lot of queer literature that uses direct address, and not just to a general you, but to a very specific you. And I think that decision in this book came quite late. I had already had it on submission with agents for most of 2020, before I realized that there was that kind of last step that would help people understand, or anchor the story, from Betty the narrator to her aunt, but also contain all the things that they have this shared knowledge. But in thinking about like why does that work especially well for queer literature, I think that for me it's like wrestling with the agency that storytelling can give you, and sort of experimenting with your voice for the first time and being aware of your authority as a narrator and trying to use it well, and to use it very specifically. I mean, there's a great deal of relativity that is part of sort of the queer aesthetic. So like speaking directly to a single person sort of contains all the universes of this novel, while being still quite intimate.
Yes. I mean, you make the point incredibly well. I don't, I just think of like, even the book is like, the book is very specific in some ways. It's very specific about the specific Palestinian-Israeli conflict, whatever you want to call it. But there are also so many more universal ideas, right? That's the way you talk about it. Okay. Yeah.
And it is very much a Palestinian story, but at the same time, I mean, you've noticed the folkloric sort of mythic thread that runs through it too, with the retelling of the story of the Tower of Babel, which I grew up in the church, and I was very familiar with this story as God was upset at humanity for having built this great tower after the flood, and felt like it was an act of hubris, and God destroyed this tower and made everyone in the world speak different languages. So it was really a story about division and difference, and punishment. But in The Skin and Its Girl, Nuha kind of rewrites this story and says that God was this sort of ectoplasmic creature that was assigned to monitor Earth by no decision that anybody remembers having made, and the humankind was trying to collaborate and cooperate and celebrate their survival. And sort of the idea of buildings runs through the whole book. I mean, the towers of soap, whenever it's sort of stacked to dry, and these sort of columns, and the soap factory itself, and the different houses that Betty grows up in. But by the end of the novel, it's sort of presenting this image of the second flood, climate change, I suppose, and bringing us back into this wider humanity where we do need to remember how to collaborate, and that oftentimes creating possibilities, you need to work with what is and not with what should be. So it's not just about one conflict, but sort of about this, the positive and negative of humanity, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. That you were sitting with that during. I'm sounding like it's on submission, but you were doing editing. It was interesting that you were sitting with that during COVID. You're talking about collaboration in the world and division, and I mean, unfortunately, it was Exhibit A for that, right?
In a lot of ways, yeah. I mean, I think that there were a lot of smaller communities. I mean, it's certainly, I was aware of a lot of the writers' relief work that individual,
Right.
presses and community organizations did. And I mean, I think that just sort of highlights that it's okay to have a bunch of different communities that are fundamentally,
Hmm.
you know, different in purpose from one another, but they can all be doing similar,
Right.
pro-social work. I
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
believe in that. I mean,
Mutual aid societies and such. Yeah.
but of course, my wife's in healthcare and saw a lot of the
Oh,
negative too. So,
yes. Oh boy. The book starts off with Betty. I mean, she died at birth, which obviously sounds oxymoronic, right? She died, was came back to life, if you will, or never was dead. I don't know how you would say that, but they were literally talking. The doctor was literally like, "What time? What's the time of death?" And came back to life, or if you will, as blue,
mhm,
silver streaks, but blue, like not like not like, oh, that person's not breathing, looks a little blue, like blue. I mean, like you'd
cobalt
see
blue.
on cobalt blue, right? Like you'd see
Mhm,
on the cover. Um, the parents at the time, her parents have a rift. Is that the idea was there was going to be an adoption as soon as Betty was to be born. Pretty much all the papers have pretty much been signed. She was to be adopted, and that's where we get the whole idea of her difference, which is a very salient one, which is in her skin color, that is a blue that doesn't exist necessarily. We learn about some other situations, some other stories like that.